I want to tell you about the exact moment my ex-boyfriend walked into a conference room for his final job interview and realized the regional director sitting at the head of the table was me. He didn't say anything for almost 5 full seconds. I counted them. The same way I count everything when I need to stay calm. 3 years earlier, he told our entire friend group I was too career-focused to make him happy. That same week, I found out he'd been sleeping with a coworker for 4 months. He had no idea, walking into that room, that the woman deciding whether he got this job was the woman he'd cheated on. And called cold. And told everyone couldn't be loved properly because she cared too much about work. Stay with me. Because what happened in the next 40 minutes is the part of this story I still think about. Welcome to Signed in Silence, where we tell quiet stories about the people who underestimated us. And the slow, undeniable way the truth eventually introduces itself. My name is Sasha Holloway. I'm 31 years old. And I want to start this story 3 years before that interview. Because you need to understand exactly what kind of relationship I walked away from. Before you understand exactly what walked back into my life. I met Derek when I was 25. At a friend's birthday party in a crowded apartment in Capitol Hill. He worked in pharmaceutical sales. I worked as an associate at a marketing agency, the kind of job where you put in long hours early in your career because that's how you build a career worth having later. He had a good laugh. He asked good questions. For the first year, things were genuinely good. The problems started slowly. The way problems usually do. I got promoted to account manager 18 months in. More responsibility. More hours, at least for a while I learned the role. Derek started making comments. Small ones, at first. You're always working. Do you ever turn your phone off? The kind of comments that sound like concern but are actually something else entirely. I want to be fair here. There were periods where I genuinely was working too much. I'm not going to pretend I was a perfectly balanced partner the entire relationship. But the comments kept coming even during the weeks I wasn't overloaded. Even during vacations. Even on a Sunday when I checked my email once, for 10 minutes, and he brought it up at dinner that night like it had ruined the entire day. He started telling our friends things. Nothing dramatic, at first. Just small comments at group dinners. Sasha's married to her job, The kind of joke that gets a laugh, and also plants something. A story about who I was, told often enough that people start believing it's just a fact about me, rather than a thing one specific person kept saying. By year 3, I was a senior account manager. I'd earned it. I worked hard for it, the way you work hard for anything that matters. And Derek's comments had stopped being jokes entirely. You care more about your job than me, he said one night, after I'd missed a dinner reservation because a client had an emergency the same evening. I apologized. I meant the apology. And I also knew, somewhere underneath the apology, that this had become a pattern I didn't have full control over anymore, because the version of me Derek had decided existed wasn't entirely the actual me. 3 weeks later, I found out about Maya. I want to tell this part plainly, because there's no need to dress it up. Maya worked with Derek. They'd been seeing each other for 4 months by the time I found out. I found out the way people usually find out these things, by accident, through a text that lit up on his phone while he was in the shower, a text that wasn't trying to be careful enough. I didn't scream. I want you to know that, because I think it matters for the rest of this story. I sat at the kitchen table and waited for him to come out of the bathroom. And I asked him directly. And he didn't deny it for very long, because there wasn't really a version of denying it that was going to hold up. He said something I've thought about many times since. He said, "You were never really there, Sasha." Not really. I needed someone who could actually be present. I left that night. I packed a bag and stayed at my friend Priya's apartment for 2 weeks while I found my own place. And I want to tell you honestly that I spent a lot of those 2 weeks wondering if he was right. If I really had been too absent. If the career I was building had cost me something I should have valued more. It took me almost a year to fully understand that he wasn't describing me. He was describing a story he needed to tell, in order to make what he did feel less like a choice and more like a consequence. What I didn't know, in those first weeks, was what Derek was telling other people. I found out through Priya, mostly. She still ran in some of the same circles. Derek had told the group, repeatedly, that I was too focused on my career to make any relationship work. That I'd basically abandoned the relationship long before he met Maya. That he'd tried, for years, to get me to prioritize him, and I never did. Some people believed it. I want to be honest about that, because it's part of the story too. Some of our mutual friends drifted away from me in those months, not dramatically, just quietly, the way people drift when they've decided a simpler story is easier to hold on to than a complicated one. I lost a few friendships I genuinely valued. Not because anyone confronted me. Just because invitations stopped coming. I didn't fight the narrative. I want to explain why, because I think it matters. Fighting it would have meant constantly defending myself to people who'd already decided what they believed. And I didn't have the energy for that, on top of everything else I was rebuilding. So I let it go. I focused on my job, which, ironically, was the one part of my life Derek had decided was the problem. It turned out to be the part of my life that actually held. Within a year, I was promoted to senior manager at a different agency, a better one, with a client roster that included 2 national retail brands. Within 2 years, I'd been recruited by a regional marketing firm called Heartline Collective, as their associate director. Within 3 years, the year this story actually happens, I was regional director, overseeing 4 offices and a team of 40. I want to give you a specific number, the way I always do, because specific numbers are the thing that actually changes a story someone's decided to believe. My division at Heartline generated $4.2 million in client revenue last year. I built the team that did that. From almost nothing, 3 years earlier. I didn't think about Derek much during those years. I want to be honest about that too. This isn't a story about a woman who spent 3 years quietly plotting. It's a story about a woman who built a life. And then, by total accident, found out exactly how that life intersected with the man who'd told everyone she couldn't build one. Here's how it happened. Heartline had an open position. Senior account executive, in the office I directly oversee. We'd been searching for 3 months. My hiring manager, a sharp woman named Renee who reports to me, had narrowed the candidate pool to 4 finalists for the final round. I review final round candidates personally, for any role at the director level and above, which this one was, because I take hiring seriously and because the people I bring into my division reflect directly on the work we do. Renee sent me the 4 resumes on a Tuesday afternoon. I read through them quickly, the way I read through most things at that stage. Names, backgrounds, experience. I got to the 3rd one. Derek Voss. I want to tell you honestly that for a moment, I assumed it was a different Derek Voss. It's not a rare name. I scrolled down to his work history. Pharmaceutical sales for 6 years. Then a transition into marketing, 3 years ago, right around the time we broke up, which made a certain kind of sense I didn't think about too hard in the moment. 2 companies since then. A photo, eventually, on his LinkedIn profile linked at the top of the resume. It was him. I sat with that for a long moment. I want to describe what I felt, because I think it's more complicated than people might expect. It wasn't anger, exactly. It wasn't satisfaction either, not yet. It was something closer to surprise at how small the world actually is, and a very specific, very calm question forming in my head. What do I actually want to do with this? I had options. I could have pulled him from the candidate pool quietly, telling Renee I had a conflict of interest, which would have been true, and let someone else handle the final round entirely. That would have been the clean option. The option that avoided any complication. I thought about it seriously. I want you to know that, because I don't think the choice I made was obviously the right one. There's a version of this story where the better decision is to step away entirely and let the process run without me anywhere near it. But I also thought about something else. Derek hadn't applied to my company by accident, in the sense that he was applying for a real job, for real reasons, presumably because he needed one and the role fit his experience. He had no way of knowing I worked there. Heartline wasn't a place I'd ever told mutual friends about, and my online presence, deliberately, doesn't advertise my workplace in detail. He wasn't targeting me. This was simply the specific, narrow coincidence of two people's professional paths crossing years after their personal one ended. Which meant the question wasn't whether he was trying to find me. The question was just whether I was capable of running a fair, professional process for a candidate I happened to have history with. I decided I was. And I decided that stepping back, pretending this coincidence hadn't happened, would have been its own kind of dishonesty, a small evasion dressed up as professionalism. I told Renee the truth. Not the personal history in detail, but enough. I know one of the final round candidates personally, from several years ago. It won't affect how I evaluate him, but I wanted you to know before the panel. Renee, to her credit, just nodded and said, "Do you want me to handle his round solo, or do you still want to be in the room?" "I want to be in the room," I said. The interview was scheduled for the following Thursday. Final round, 3 pain lists, 45 minutes, the standard format for that level of role. Renee, our creative director, a man named Marcus, and me. I want to walk you through what I felt in the days leading up to that Thursday, because I think it's the most honest part of this story. I didn't spend those days savoring it. I didn't tell anyone outside of work, not even Priya, not yet. I prepared for the interview exactly the way I prepare for every final round interview, reviewing his resume in detail, drafting questions specific to the role, thinking through what Heartline actually needed from whoever filled this position. The personal history sat underneath all of that preparation. I won't pretend it didn't. But it didn't drive the preparation. The preparation was the preparation. Thursday came. I sat at the head of the conference table, Renee on my left, Marcus on my right, the way we always sit for final rounds. The door opened at exactly 10 o'clock. Derek walked in. He looked the same, mostly. A little heavier. A haircut that suited him less than the one he'd had 3 years ago. He was wearing a navy suit that looked new, the kind of suit you buy specifically for interview season. He had a portfolio under his arm and the specific, practiced smile of someone who's done this kind of meeting enough times to know how to perform calm. He looked at Renee first. Then Marcus. Then me. I watched it happen the way you watch weather change. The smile held for exactly 1 second too long. Then his eyes did something very small, a flicker, the look of someone whose brain is trying to process information faster than the room is giving it permission to. "Sasha," he said. "I want to tell you I said something sharp in that moment." I didn't. I said, "Hi, Derek. Please, have a seat." He sat down slowly. I watched him glance at Renee, then Marcus, clearly trying to determine whether they knew, whether this was some kind of setup, whether the room itself understood what was happening. Renee's expression gave away nothing, the way a good hiring manager's expression gives away nothing in any interview. Marcus, who genuinely had no idea about any history between us, simply opened his folder and said, "Thanks for coming in, let's get started." I want to tell you about the first 15 minutes of that interview, because I think the most honest thing I can say is that they were almost entirely normal. Marcus asked his standard questions about campaign strategy. Derek answered them competently. Not brilliantly, but competently, the way most candidates answer standard questions at this stage. Renee asked about his experience managing client relationships under pressure. He gave a reasonable answer about a difficult account he'd handled at his current job. I asked my questions in turn. I want to be completely clear about something. My questions were identical, in substance and in tone, to the questions I ask every candidate for this role. I have a standard set of competency questions I use for senior account executive interviews, refined over several years of hiring for this position, and I used them exactly as written. I didn't soften them. I didn't sharpen them either, out of some need to make the moment harder for him than it needed to be. I asked about how he'd handle a client who was unhappy with a deliverable. I asked about a time he'd had to manage competing priorities. I asked him to walk me through how he prioritizes his workload during a high-volume period. I want you to notice that last question, because I think it matters. I didn't choose it because of him. It's on my standard list, has been for 2 years, because workload prioritization is genuinely relevant to this role. But I watched him answer it, and I watched something cross his face as he answered it, something that suggested he understood, in that specific moment, the particular shape of the irony he was sitting inside. He answered it well, actually. I want to be fair about that. He talked about triaging client needs by urgency and revenue impact, about communicating proactively with stakeholders when timelines shifted, about protecting focus time for the highest value work. It was a good answer. The kind of answer that would have scored well from any candidate. I didn't say anything about the irony. I just wrote my notes and moved to the next question. About 30 minutes in, Marcus asked the closing question we ask every final round candidate. Why Heartline? Why this role, specifically, right now? Derek talked about wanting to work somewhere with strong leadership. Somewhere with clear growth paths. He mentioned, generically, that he'd researched the company and was impressed by the division's recent growth, the $4.2 million in revenue, which he'd clearly pulled from somewhere, maybe a press mention, maybe Renee's LinkedIn, maybe mine, though I doubt he'd looked at mine recently enough to connect it. He looked at me, briefly, while he said that part. I think he was trying to figure out whether to acknowledge the history directly, in the room, in front of Renee and Marcus, or whether to simply get through the interview and deal with it some other way, some other time. He chose to get through it. The interview ended at the standard 45 minutes. We thanked him for his time. Renee told him we'd be in touch within the week, the way we tell every candidate. He stood up, shook Marcus's hand, shook Renee's hand, and then stood for a second in front of me, clearly deciding whether to extend his hand at all. I extended mine first. Thank you for coming in, I said. He shook it. Briefly. Sasha, he said, quiet, just for me, while Renee was already turning to walk him out. I didn't know you worked here. I know, I said. Take care, Derek. He left. The door closed. Marcus, completely unaware of any subtext, immediately said, solid candidate, I think. Good answer on the workload question. What did you both think? I want to tell you exactly what I thought, because I think it's the most useful part of this story. I thought he was a decent candidate. Not the strongest of the four. There was another candidate, a woman named Teresa, whose answers throughout the process had shown sharper strategic thinking, more specific, more confident, with a track record that more closely matched what this role actually needed. Derek's answers were competent but generic in a few places, the kind of answers that work fine but don't distinguish a candidate in a genuinely competitive pool. I gave my honest assessment in the debrief that followed. Competent. Not the top candidate. I'd rank him third of the four. Renee and Marcus largely agreed, independently, without my needing to push them in any direction. We hired Teresa the following week. Derek received a standard rejection email, the same template we send every candidate who doesn't get the offer, generated by our applicant tracking system, signed generically by the recruiting team. I want to be completely honest with you about something. I did not reject Derek because of who he was to me 3 years earlier. I want that stated plainly, because I think it's the actual point of this story. If he had been the strongest candidate, I would have hired him, and I would have managed the discomfort of working in proximity to someone with that history, because that's what professionalism actually requires, and because using a hiring decision to settle a personal score would have made me exactly the kind of person who shapes outcomes around feelings instead of facts, which is its own kind of failure. He wasn't the strongest candidate. Teresa was. We hired Teresa because of her qualifications, full stop, in a process that would have looked identical if Derek had been a stranger I'd never met. But I want to tell you what I felt, sitting in that conference room, watching him answer a question about prioritizing workload 3 years after telling our entire friend group I cared too much about my career to ever make a relationship work. I felt something settle. Not triumph exactly. Something closer to clarity. The specific clarity of realizing that the story he told about me, the cold, career-obsessed woman who couldn't be loved properly, had simply never been the actual truth. It had been a story he needed, in order to make his own choice feel like something other than a choice. And I had spent 3 years building something real while he was busy telling people I couldn't. I never told him we hadn't hired him personally. The rejection came through our standard system, the way it does for every unsuccessful candidate. I have no idea whether he ever thought about that interview again, whether he told anyone he'd run into me, whether the irony of answering my workload question ever crossed his mind afterward the way it crossed mine. I did tell Priya, eventually, a few weeks later, over dinner. She laughed, the genuine kind, and then got quiet for a second and said, "Do you feel good about it?" I thought about the question honestly before I answered. "I feel finished with it," I said. "That's different from good. But it's enough." I think that's the most accurate way to describe what I actually felt. Not triumphant. Not vindicated in some dramatic way. Just finished. The specific, quiet relief of realizing that a story someone told about you, repeated enough times that it almost started to feel true even to you, simply could not survive contact with the actual facts of your life. I want to say something directly to you. If you've ever had someone build a story about who you are, out of their own need to make their choices feel justified. A story about being too much, or not enough, or too focused, or too distant, too anything that conveniently explains their behavior instead of describing yours. You don't need to spend your life disproving that story to the people who repeated it. You don't need a conference room moment, or a dramatic reveal, or anyone's face to change when they realize the truth. Most of the time, that moment never comes. You'll never get to watch them recalculate. What you can do, the only thing that actually works, is exactly what I did without realizing, for 3 years, that I was building toward anything. Keep building the actual life. Let the story they told just sit there, unconfirmed by anything you actually do, until eventually, it has nothing left to feed on. Sometimes, rarely, by total accident, you get to watch it collapse in real time. Most of the time, you don't. Either way, the building was always the point. Not the watching. That's my story. A final round interview that started with a man walking into a room he had no idea I'd be sitting in, and ended with a rejection email generated by a system that had absolutely no idea about any of it either, because it was never personal in the first place. It was simply, finally, just the truth. If this story meant something to you, if someone ever told a story about you that made their choices easier and your worth smaller, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Signed in Silence, because the next story is already waiting, and the woman in it is about to discover something about her own family that she never expected. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I'll see you in the next one.